Okay, we've had the first part of the lazy afternoon information, which is where we talked about the quilt, where I got the idea or the pattern from, which was the American Quilt Retailer. We have the printed copy, which we can get a free copy from the Urban Elements website if you just punch in lazy afternoon in the search bar. We did all of our fabric selection and cutting, and you see I'm working with Ohio State colors today. I still have not heard what your favorite team is. I really thought there would be a little bit more rumbling about whose team was superior, and so I'm really surprised that we haven't heard that much about that. But we have all of the pieces that we need to start with at the sewing machine. I layered mine so that there are side A and side B, and these are, let's see what the letters are. I have B's and C's layered together for each of the two sides. And then I also have the strips that are going to make up the inner border. Now I can piece these together in all 5 pieces in one long length, because that's how we're going to attach them to the quilt. We'll measure and trim, but we're going to have them all added together. So it may be long enough, but I'm not sure with the width of fabric decreasing if it will be anymore, because it's been a while since I've done one. So we're going to set up the camera so you can see me at the machine, and you're going to see how quick piecing these goes together and why they call it a lazy afternoon. I have on neutral thread in the machine. The machine's all loaded. I have a 37 foot on the Bernina. A 37 foot is a 1/4 inch foot. If you don't have a Bernina, you might use whatever manufacturer's 1/4 inch foot that you have, because all of our seams for this entire quilt will be 1/4 inch. So just to do something simple very first, I'm just going to take these long strips, which are going to be our inner border. For the red ones are going to be for one side, the gray ones will be for the other. So I'm going to piece all of my red pieces together end to end. I'm just going to do a seam here. And I didn't trim off the selvage. I could do that after I'm done. This is such a small seam, I don't feel necessary to pin this. If you want to pin it, by all means do what makes you comfortable. I'm just lining my 1/4 inch foot right up against the edge of the printed selvage so that that will get trimmed off. Now these two are sewn together. I'm just going to open this out and repeat that process until I have all 5 of these joined together. Now one of my selvages is much wider than the other, and that's the one that I have facing up, and I'm going to use that as my seam guide so that I make sure that I'm getting more than enough of the printed fabric in the seam. Now once I have these 5 pieces sewn together end to end, then I can go ahead and start doing the gray pieces. They won't be connected to the red. I'm going to start a separate joining, but I will have those all together, and then I can get them pressed and trimmed if I need trimming in between the sewing. Now what I'm doing here is called chain piecing. You'll see that in books or other tutorials. That's when you're just feeding strips through one after the other. You're only leaving an 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch of thread between each of these units, and then you can go back and trim those. The purpose is for that when the thread goes through the machine, and sometimes when you start, the thread will get pulled down inside, and especially if you're doing triangles or pieces, and so with something just sewn through, it's holding the top and bobbin threads out, and it's preventing them from getting tucked down into the hole that goes down into the bobbin. The other thing is you're not using a lot of thread where you're pulling the piece out and you have 5 or 6 inches of thread in between each seam and wasting thread. So chain piecing just does a little bit of thread saving. It's faster than pulling out each piece and trimming it, and it doesn't get caught down into the needle hole of the throat plate. So now I have all of the pieces sewn together for both the front and back of the quilt for the inner border. Now I just have the center body of the quilt, and I'm going to start with the larger piece, which is 7.5 inches cut, and those I'm going to be sewing side by side with the gray. And those of you who have the instruction sheet printed can follow along. Now we're going to trim this whole unit down when we're finished, because I know that the selvages for each of the 2 fabrics are going to be different widths. I'm not going to worry about that right now. I'm just going to line up my first piece, the 4.5 strip, on top of the 7.5 strip. The selvages are completely flat on top of each other. After I get these sewn together and pressed, the whole unit, then we'll trim the top and bottom, and that will determine the body of the quilt. Now if all of this bothers you up here, you can easily just trim it off and set those aside into 2 piles. This is very much a forgiving quilt, so if your seam allowance is off a little bit, if you're having younger people make one of these, if it's off a little bit, it's not going to make a really huge difference in the end. You could pin these pieces together if you wanted. I'm not pinning this because I've done it so many times, and I'm usually pretty good about keeping the 2 pieces of fabric together so they're feeding through evenly. Now at this point I could pick up the reverse side and do that, strip piece those as well, but for this first one I think I'm just going to cut and open and show you what we're going to do next. Now that we have the 7.5 inch strip sewn to the 4.5 inch strip, you could go to the iron now and iron this open, but I'm going to wait and iron all my seams at the end. So I'm just going to open up another one of the 7.5 pieces, because these are going to alternate all the way across until we run out for that side. We've only cut as many pieces as we need. So I'm going to line these back up the way that I did the first time and feed this through again. The simplicity of this design reminds me a lot of Amish style type quilt. You can very much use really beautiful fabric, but in the end this is meant to be a utilitarian quilt. One that would get heavily used. Back of the sofa, dorm rooms, actually taking it to one of your college games as a lap quilt. Because it finishes around 66 inches wide, that really is enough for really two people side by side at the stadium. Oh, I played bobbin chicken and I lost. I have to rewind my bobbin and then we'll get going again. Okay. So at this point we have two 7.5, two 4.5. I have 3 more strips to do. So already for side 1, I'm more than halfway finished. I'm just going to keep lining these selvages up together and the cut edge up together. All of this quilt is just straight line seams, all 1/4 inch seams. You could absolutely pin if you wanted to. I'm just holding them together as they feed through. Again, this quilt is not as particular as some quilts that have a lot of seams in it. This one has very few, so it's very forgiving. Two more, and this side is finished. looking to make sure I'm sewing. I don't have any idea how many of these I've made and gifted. I'm sure I taught the class for this at least 20 times. I don't know if I ever told you, one of the other reasons why people used to like to take my class, beside the fact that I would pre-cut their kit for them if they bought the fabric from our shop, was that I used to bake. And so I would bake cookies or pastries and bring them into the shop, and we would pretty much eat all day. Eat pastries, drink tea. Well, they drank coffee. I never drank this stuff. This is the last piece for the body of the quilt for side 1. I already have the inner borders pieced and ready to go. First we'll iron this or press it, and then we will trim the top and bottom to give us our finished size of the inner body. We won't know that until we trim it. The nice thing about this quilt is there's very little in the way of waste. And when it comes to collegiate fabric, I would think there's no such thing as wasted fabric. So that's it. This is the entirety of the inside body of side 1. Now we're going to repeat that whole process, but I'm not going to make you watch that for side 2. And when I finish this, then we're going to come back. We'll do the pressing, because you can't do any trimming without pressing. We're going to press, and then we're going to trim, and then we can go ahead and put our inner borders on. And after that, guess what? It's the outer border. That's how fast this quilt is. For a 66 by 66 quilt, reversible, it could be whatever the favorite fabric is. It could be Disney fabric, Marvel fabric, some kind of collegiate fabric, anything you can think of. I showed you the roses from earlier. I've done really beautiful oriental ones with this. It makes a stunning quilt because you could use a really big print. So I'm going to go ahead and get these done while you zip like a second to the next clip. When you're done with your chain piecing, you'll see you have all these little threads caught in between, but we only have about a 1/2 inch thread. You'll just take your scissors or your snips and go in and separate those. But you'll see you barely have a 1/4 inch thread waste on each side. Now while we have these still folded, I can look at my seam line on each of the pieces and just go ahead and cut the selvage off. Now I could have done this first, but I chose not to. And I could choose to not even worry about the piece and just let it get sewn into the project. Open them up and let it sew out. But while I have them all neatly folded there, I'm going to go ahead and trim that off. And then I'm going to press all of these open. Nope. I'm going to press them to one side. I don't press my seams open unless there's a reason. So all of these pieces of selvage are getting cut off. I still have a good 1/4 inch away from my seam, so I'm not worried about those. And now I can get rid of all that. Okay, I have these now on my ironing station, and I always just like to press down on where the stitching was and then slide it open. press that to one side. They're all the same color, so I don't have to worry about that. They're not going to intersect with anything in the quilt, so I don't have to worry about that seam lining up or butting up against anything else. So I could just press them down and then press it flat. And I'll keep doing this all the way across until we have one very large strip of our inner border. Pressing on top, and now pressing that to one side. With something like this, you can't even see the seam once it's done. This should be, I think, the last one for the gray side. Yep, that's all of our pieces for the inner border for the gray side. Now I can repeat that for the Ohio State side. Pressing these seams down on a project like this isn't really critical because we're not matching seams, but it's just a habit that I get into, and I'd rather not break myself of habits that I need, even if I only need them sometimes. They say that it takes 30 days to get into a good habit, like brushing your teeth twice a day, but it only takes 3 days of missing that habit to break yourself of it. So I try and do my good habits all the time. And that is our 5 pieces for both sides. Now I'm just going to wear these around my neck as a big scarf while I get the other piece ready. Okay, I hope that you can see enough of this to see what I'm doing without seeing the mess in my room. But I have this piece so that the seam is exposed, just like I did with the inner border. I'm going to press that seam down, and then I'm going to go ahead and lift that piece up and press that one so that the red is going to go to the gray side. Doesn't really matter because they're both about the same value. Then I'm just going to repeat that. Press the seam. And then open the fabric and press it. I'll keep repeating that as we go. Keep in mind this project is kind of like a weeknight dinner. It's really down and dirty. You could get this finished really quick. You could have this memorized almost like one of your favorite weeknight meals. If you need to skip a step or two, it's not going to make a huge difference because this is really a forgiving pattern. Now these last two, I'm just going to do it in the other directions because it's smaller. I can get it done a little faster. Might even do these both at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead and repeat this process. I'm going to put this one on the cutting table flat so that it stays ironed. And then we're going to go ahead and work on the other side, and then we'll trim them both. Now I have two big squarish units, and again, you don't have to stress a ton over this. You could use a large square and lay this up so it lines up on the edge of the quilt, and then trim on this side if you wanted it perfectly square. But this again is a very user-friendly project. I'm just going to line up the two edges on the side, and then I have my two selvage sides on the left and the right, and I'm just going to lay the ruler so that I'm cutting off the selvage on each side. And if it's like 1/8 of an inch, you don't have to worry because that's going to get caught in the next seam allowance. But I'm just going to do a fairly simple cut, cutting off the selvage on one side. I'll just look and see if I need to redo that a little for the other side, and it looks like I do. So I will just trim it a little bit more. I have my line of the ruler on the fold of the fabric. Now I'm going to repeat that process for the other side. That side is good. So now we have our finished square unit for side one. We could put this aside and take it down, get ready to put the inner border on it. And now I'm just going to trim the other side that I have ironed. You could do this open, but it just makes it a little bit harder because no ruler is going to be that long. Folding it just makes it a little bit easier to get it underneath the ruler. I can line the fold up with the line on the mat if I want to have the mat help guide where I'm cutting. That one's good. Flip it over just so it's a little bit easier to see or cut. And there you have the second one. Now, generally these are both going to be approximately the same size because we have the same two fabrics used on the front and back. But again, this is a user-friendly quilt, and it's not meant to be that these line up identically to the front and back. If you're OCD and you try and get these channels to line up with the front and back, you're never going to succeed, because it's just would be nearly impossible to get both sides to line up unless you really knocked yourself into a coma with it. So it's going to be really close. Let close be enough. We're going to do an overall panto, or we're going to do a grid, and so it doesn't matter if these are matched up exactly from one side to the other. But that's the impact of what we're going to get. So we're going to take our two sides back downstairs, add the inner border for each side, and then we're going to add that outer border. I have my front and my back. I'm just going to put one of them aside. It doesn't really matter which side you start on, but I'm going to start sewing across all of the seams first. And I'm going to use the gray will be for this side where the majority of the quilt is red, or one theme. We're going to use the opposite. So the majority of the front is, in my case, the Buckeyes fabric. Let me see if I can get all that off. I'm going to look for the end, and now I'm just going to line up. I have a little bit of selvage on here. I'm just going to let that sit just past where I'm going to start so I can trim that off. Lining up my edge of the inner border with the top of the inner part of the body of the quilt. I'm using my 1/4 inch foot again. Now this one piece is only 2.5 inch strip. Because we're dealing with a smaller strip, we do want to watch a little bit more than we did with the other pieces, our seam allowance. The smaller our strip is that we're sewing, the more critical that seam allowance becomes. Now you can press and cut in between, but when I get to the end here, I'm just going to take my scissors or my rotary cutter and just trim off the length that I don't need on here. Let's see if I can get it. And then I can go ahead and start sewing the next piece on the opposite side, which in my case will be the bottom. So I have the top on, now I'm going to do the bottom. And after I finish with that, then I'll go ahead and press these open, do a really good trim on the excess of that inner border, and then I can go ahead and do the two sides. This would be good for any kind of charity project if the size wasn't too big, because you could do it fast. You also could have different people doing pressing, cutting, layering the kits, some people just sitting and sewing. Because of the way you layer it before you cut it, there really isn't a way to get the pieces mixed up too bad. You only give each person enough strips that they could actually piece it together. So that is the top and bottom of this side, and I have all my piece left over for the two sides. Now I'm going to work on the other one. This one is primarily the more solid side, almost all gray, so I know I'm going to use the ClassiQ fabric as the contrast. And as I may have said during the opening part, sometimes what I would do is pick a third fabric and use as the inner border on both sides that would still contrast with both, just as a way of getting another piece of fabric in there. And because it's so simple a project, it's really not gilding the lily too much to go ahead and spice it up just a little. I got into quilting so that I could work with fabrics that I loved. I never really thought I'd be working with ClassiQ football fabric. I just have to tell you. Even though that would make my dad happy. I think it's time I change my rotary blade. So now I'm going to go ahead, oh, do I have one more? Yes, I think I do. Yes, I'm going to go ahead and do the bottom of this side, and then I will press the seams open. Press the seams, not open. And I will trim the two edges really carefully, and then I will do the inner border for the two sides of both sides of the quilt. If you got together with a friend, a neighbor, and you assembly lined the production of these, you could have all different combinations of fabric, because it'd be very easy to keep track of the pieces since there's only two fabrics in each one. But you could really pump out a great number of these in a single day. I've done a lot of sewing for this piece, but I'm still on my first cup of tea, and it's only about 2/3 the way. So I have a lot of messing about because I don't have my iron on down here, I don't have my cutting table down here, so I'm running up and downstairs to the mess, and I'm fidgeting with cameras and lights. If you were serious about knocking some of these out, you could knock out probably 10 of them in a day. So I'm going to go ahead now, I'm going to press these really good, and then I'm going to trim these two corner units really well, so that when I do the other two sides of each of those, that they look really sharp. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll get right back to doing those, or I may just skip ahead to the outer border for you, because once you've seen one inner border, you've seen them all. I trimmed off both of my ends where I had just attached the 2.5 inch strip, just to make sure they were nice and square. And now I'm going to attach the same color. I'm going to use my Ohio State fabric here to frame in the other side of the inner border. So I'm just going to show that one time, and then I'll go ahead and complete the other sides of the front, and then move on to the back. Again, we're just using a straight 1/4 inch seam here, nothing fancy about it. And I'm using a 1/4 inch foot. If you didn't have a 1/4 inch foot, or you didn't have a way to match exactly a 1/4 inch, if all of your seams were the same, for instance 3/8 or a 1/2 inch, that would be fine. The quilt would end up a little bit different size, but as long as all the seams are the same, it wouldn't matter. The finished size may change by an inch maybe. You probably could do math and use different size fabric. Most of our cotton goods used to be 45 inches, then they went down to 43 or 42. In the instance of both of these, they were only 40 and a half, 40 and a 1/4 inches wide. So we've lost about 4.5 or 5 inches of fabric. But you probably could use different type of goods. Like sometimes I see flannel at 54 or 56 inches. You probably could use some math and reconfigure this a little bit to accommodate a little bit wider strips. But you would have to do math all the way out to the border. Because it was a wider piece, you'd need more yardage for the outer border. If I get a chance, I'll explain this again later, but also if you wanted to make this more specifically fit a dorm bed, when you're cutting the outer border pieces, instead of cutting them in 4 equal widths, an example, we did these at 10 inches, you could cut 2 of them at 5 inch strips and 2 of them at 15 inch. The 15 inch would be the top and bottom, and the 5 inch would be the 2 sides. So what you would be making is a more narrow quilt that was a little bit longer, and it would that sizing would fit a dorm size bed almost perfectly. So that's just something I think I may have one to show you if I remember. So now we have 3 sides of this with the inner border. I have this side left, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that one. But at this point I'm going to turn the music on and edit this part out, because there's nothing any more different about this one than the one that I just put on. So I'm going to jam a little bit while you get to flash forward. So back to, you can see how much of the strip that I have left after I've done all 4 sides, and this isn't uncommon. This is the one piece of waste that you may have. Depending on the width of the fabric and the width of the inner square, this is going to change for each of you. But that is what the first piece of waste that we have in this whole quilt, aside from the selvage. So I'm going to go ahead and do the other one. I anticipate the other one to be approximately the same, but I won't know till I get there. But I'm not going to hold you hostage for that. Alexa, resume. Doesn't really matter which one of these sides you start with, but I'm going to go ahead and do the one with the primarily the Ohio State fabric. So I'm going to use that as the border. Again, I want to go across the short side of this, which I believe is the top and bottom, because once I get those added on, it creates a longer length, and I want that length to match the channels. So I'm just going to open up my border, and I'm just going to attach this first one going across the top or the bottom, whichever side it happens to be. It would be the same. Again, I'm just going to use a 1/4 inch foot. You could pin this absolutely if you wanted to. I'm just going to monitor it very closely here at the machine, making sure that the bottom isn't feeding too much. I don't want to ruffle quilt. I'm just having my drawer open a little bit so I could hold the weight of that. One of these tables I have, these tables are from Horn of America. One of them actually has a component that you can open the door and set the lid on it, so it creates a longer extension there. But I think that's the one that I have up in my sewing room. I'm on a group chat with my sister and my nieces and nephew, and every time there's a game, they all get on there and chat back and forth about who's going to win, who's the best team, who's the best player, and I always make odd comments. When they talk about the Buckeyes, I talk about Buckeye recipes for candy. So now you know why I'm the black sheep of the family. This part goes pretty quick. Now I'm going to have a pretty good chunk left over from the end of this border, and I'm going to have that on each of the top pieces, top and bottom. I'm just going to leave that on there until I can stand up and press it. I'm going to turn the quilt over completely so that I am working now. If I did the top, I'm doing the bottom now. And keep in mind, as fast as this is going, this is the outer border now. So I really don't have a whole lot more to do on here, except get it ready for quilting. Now, whether or not you are going to quilt this or you're going to send this to someone who has a long arm machine, because the front and back of this quilt are the same size, if you're going to send this to somebody else to quilt, what you will have to do is add some strips, some scrap strips to the side of the backing so that the backing's large enough to attach to the frame. Now at the top and bottom, what I need is at least 2 inches on the top and bottom. That gives me enough clearance to be able to get past the pins or whatever else somebody would use to attach the quilt backing to the frame. but on the sides I probably would do 5 to 6 inches. Now you're going to have to ask your long armor how much they would require. I think I could get away with 5 to 6 inches on each side. That allows you to attach the backing to the frame, and then this could be quilted without much problem. Now if you're doing it on a domestic machine, you wouldn't have to add any scraps. So while I'm sitting here, I'm going to go ahead and do the other side, top and bottom again. And I'm going to use the other side's fabric. I looked at the Urban Elements website today, just before coming out here, and I've chosen, it looks like they had 8 different quilting patterns that were specific to football. The only team I found was, I think, Broncos. I think it was the Broncos. So I didn't find an Ohio State pattern, but there was one by Jessica Schick called Football Stars, and that's the one I'm going to use for this quilt. If you do have to add strips to the backing to make it large enough to fit the quilt, just know that those strips will be trimmed off as long as the long armor centers the top on the back. And I would just look before you choose the back. Sometimes, depending on the width of fabric, one side may be a little bit wider than the other. Because the quilt is reversible, it doesn't really matter which one ultimately becomes the back. So I would just choose the widest one for the back. Another little note here, I don't know if you noticed, but this is my selvage edge of this strip. Only 2 of the 4 strips would have that. But I went ahead and included that on this side so that when I open it up it would be towards the outside, and then that could always be trimmed off as well. Ooh. Oh. after we get done adding the outer border to the top and bottom, this is what we have. So I have that for one side, and then again for the other. I had left the strip long, and so after I had finished, I just trimmed off the extra piece at the top and bottom, and those will be like the second pieces of waste that we have from this quilt. It's not really a lot. So now I'm going to go ahead and add on the two sides for each of the two sides of the quilt, and that will pretty much conclude the piecing section, and then we get to the quilting. So again, there's a lot of quilting ways on the this quilt. The instructions, which I drew to the floor, recommend machine quilting it, and they do a diagonal grid on the domestic machine. I don't know if I ever read the intro. It says, "The Lazy Afternoon Quilt, a two-sided quilt for twice the fun. The Lazy Afternoon Quilt is a unique project that makes two quilts in one, all in a lazy afternoon. The back is the reverse of the front, and both can be completed in just a few hours." That part's very true. The design is clean, simple. Be sure to showcase two large florals or a snappy classic plaids for dynamic results. I don't think I would use two large florals. As I said, you want to be able to see the chains, the bars in the quilt. And the quilting, add the quilting, and the quilt is perfect for snuggling on a lazy afternoon. So I think so far it's kept its word as far as what kind of project it is and how long it takes to finish. So I'm going to go ahead and do those other two sides, and then we're going to show you what the finished result is. And this is just going to be one of many that I have made. This is a really, really great pattern to have in your toolkit. Now we're going to add the left and right borders for the quilt. I'm just going to check to see if I have any selvages on here to make sure those are oriented to the outside. This piece does not have one. Again, you could easily pin here if you're just starting out and you want to make sure that you don't have any ruffles from the feed dogs at the bottom of the sewing machine advancing the bottom piece of fabric too quickly. I'm just going to keep sewing. I will show you when I get this off the frame and get this to the ironing phase. The iron, there's no special instructions really. If you really have one really light and really dark fabric, we usually like the seam allowance to be folded under the darker side so it doesn't show through. But again, this is a very easy quilt. It's meant to be utilitarian, highly used, so don't stress yourself out on the little tiny details too much. When you get done putting all four sides on, you're going to have to trim two pieces. One is on the left side and one's going to be at the right side. The amount that you trim off is something that you could test. I'm going to show you how I trim it in a second, but you could measure the two pieces that you trim off to see how close they are together, because we know we cut them 66 inches long and the quilt sides should be approximately the same, so the amount of extra really should be very close to the same. It's just to give you an idea of, in my case I didn't pin, how accurate my sewing was with pinning, with not pinning those two pieces of fabric, the body of the quilt with the outer border. But other than that, all four sides are on, and now I'm going to trim it, and I'm going to show you how I line up the ruler with the seam line, and then we'll show you both sides. Okay, you can see how this part of the border extends past the body of the quilt, so we need to trim that off. I'm going to have my ruler so that it goes across the whole piece I need to trim, and I'm going to use one of the horizontal markings on the ruler to line up to this seam line. And when I have that lined up right to the edge here, line here, and it extends to the whole length, then I'm going to go ahead and hold my ruler in place and give that a cut. And I'm cutting it twice because my rotary cutter has a little notch in it. So I've done that for the one side. I'm going to have to do it for the other. And these are the only two pieces that I'll have to trim on this side of the quilt. I will also have to do the same thing for the other side. Horizontal line on the seam, lined up with the edge of the fabric. I'm far enough that I can cut the whole piece of fabric. And now I can measure these two pieces just to see about how close they are. And that's about 1/4 of an inch difference, so that's pretty good on the sewing. So now that I've trimmed all of the pieces off, in the end, these are the pieces that I had extra. These are two pieces of the outer border from the top and bottom, and then we have a piece of the 2.5 inch strip left that was from the inner border, and then these two little pieces from the outside. Now I have that on both. So as far as waste go, I think this is a fairly waste-free project, and the pieces that you do trim are usable. It's not like going to be about 1.5 million half-square triangles. The project goes really quickly, and in this case almost identical in size on the front and back. Sometimes if there's one of the fabrics is 40 inches wide and the other is 45 inches wide, you may have one side or the other be a little bit bigger, because it all depends on the width of fabric. But you can see in the end you have a really beautiful reversible quilt. This could be done in 1 million different themes. I used Ohio State fabric, and I haven't heard many people say any other team was better than that, so I don't know, maybe Ohio State is supreme. I just haven't heard anything to the contrary in the comments. So the next phase for me is to get this on the long arm. I want to long arm quilt this. Now the original one that I showed was, this was so many years ago. This could be 25 years ago or more. I sent this to a long armer, and basically they just doodled on the quilt. They just doodled some hearts. I think they were mimicking the pattern in the fabric. I think we could do a little bit better than that this time. So I have picked out a panto with a football on it and some stars. I believe it's called Football All Stars by Jessica Schick. It's a digital design, and so I'm going to get this loaded on the machine for the next video. What I will have to do is choose the back, and I'm going to have to add some strips to the width of that so that it will fit onto the long arm. I'm going to do 2 inches at the top and bottom, any scrap fabric, and I'm going to make a center mark on the quilt itself so I know that the quilt is loaded center on the leaders. Then I will put the batting on it, and I also have 5-inch strips on the 2 sides because that's where I need extra to attach to the side clamps. So once I get that loaded, then we'll have another video out of it. I think the football pattern will be really cool. So that is it for the piecing section of the lazy afternoon, and I'm really excited to have finally gotten to do this. I can't tell you, this is probably the most reproduced quilt I've ever made. I don't generally like to make the same quilt over and over, but this one goes so quick and it fits so many different needs. So download the pattern, give it a try, and let me hear about your favorite professional football team or basketball.